So thank you. Good morning. I'm sorry I don't have any images, so you will have to stick to hearing my sort of English. And besides, the title there is not even a relevant title. It was just a phrase coined by Kurt, I think. Before I could tell him that next the Gaudi came nothing at all. So I will try to tell what we are doing anyway. But
that's an answer in itself, which is false.
Anyway, thank you, Kurt, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to hear to the other speakers. I think I should take out my glasses because I cannot read that anymore. So in the 2000s, I coordinated a small project for Gaudi, which you probably all know, a European program on architecture, which brought together several archives services across Europe to discuss the long-term management of computer-generated architectural archives. Unfortunately, since this program came to an end in 2008, the opportunities to further this expertise have been very limited. My aim today is to present a brief report on the Gaudi process, very brief because it's well past now, and to present then our current work at the IFA archives and thinking if we do think about that. So Gaudi was a European program led by the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine and the CIVA in Brussels. The 20th Century Architectural Archive, which I represent, was leader for one of the actions, focusing on architects' archives. Alongside other less tricky subjects, several European colleagues, including the RIBA, represented then by Eleanor Ghosn and then Irina Murray, worked with us on some pioneering approaches to managing architects' digital records, either as a standalone collection or within a larger archive. The outputs from this project were a conference that was held in Paris, that has been mentioned already, and its proceedings published in 2008, and a series of recommendations for architecture firms. Shortly afterwards, in June 2009, the NAI organized another conference, and that was a sort of a continuation of Gaudi, and then that a group of European partners didn't do anything more together. Why did the Gaudi program come to an end? In 2008, we had reached the end of 2 3-year funding periods, Gaudi 1 and 2, and with this funding, a range of very varied actions had been carried out, including the work on archives, but not only, and most actions were just continued from the first grant to the second, from the first period to the second. However, in 2008, the European community told that if there was to be a third funding application, we would have to present a new and different objective. For all the project partners, it would have meant adding further piecework on the new issue, and at the same time, as far as possible, continuing research on digital archives outside the Gaudi framework. With the European partners, we thought about applying to run a Gaudi 3 program with a project for a multilingual thesaurus, but in the end we decided against this idea. Personally, I had major misgivings about project feasibility and even whether it was necessary or urgent at all. Most of the other actions from the Gaudi program, which were very varied and not only on archives, came to an end then, and all that remains today under the Gaudi label is a European architecture competition still run by the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine. Of course, it is a pity that this joint research effort has come to an end. It was a welcome financial boost and a time when a lot of ideas were discussed. Over the 6-year period, a fairly large amount of grant funding was provided by the European community, 200,000 euro for each one of the 3-year periods. But in fact, it didn't amount to much in terms of research resources once it had been divided up in between 6 or 8 partners, and money for meeting was taken off. Over the course of the project and its meetings, a very friendly group of experts began to emerge, despite the geographical and linguistic distances. However, the tangible research output from this budget was fairly patchy and limited, I would say. This 3-year budget was similar to the budget that the Art Institute of Chicago invested in the research handed over to Christine Fallon that we've just heard about, and which undoubtedly offers a much more complete overview of the subject than what we achieved. Nevertheless, in Europe, there isn't a single institution that could have accessed that level of subsidy for this subject. And our joint work helped us determine the key questions to be answered, which have not changed so much in the course of the years. I can still remember one of the early meetings where we all were asking, so what on earth are metadata, where to find them, how to keep them. We were just record managers with lots to learn. Indeed, when we presented our work at ICAM in 2004 or 6, the non-archivists in the room told us, "You're not architects, so you will never understand digital archives about architecture." It was not very encouraging, but it was not totally wrong, and I will come back to this later. I was not supposed to make you laugh at all. After the end of Gaudi, after the 2009 Rotterdam conference, we thought we would be able to get together with some of the nearest institutions, the NIE in Rotterdam, the VAE in Antwerp, the RIBA. We thought we could do that without any special funding stream, just to keep in touch with ongoing research and advances. However, we didn't really do anything of the sort. So, what has been going on at the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine archives since then? Let's start with mentioning the material we are working with. Currently, we only hold 2 archives that contain digital files. I mean born digital archives, of course. 2 collections out of 400, that is an astonishingly low proportion, and when I was hearing to Kurt, I was ashamed of, but anyway, it's like that. We have had very little opportunity to work with these files anyway. After the end of the Gaudi program, Florence Vierre, who had coordinated and led the work on archiving the first digital files, left the organization very quickly. Since then, we have had 2 opportunities to spend a few months working on the issue. That means about once every 2 years. The first time was 2 years ago with an initial assessment of the work required to classify and ensure the long-term preservation of one of the archives. The second time is this year on a new assignment that has just begun, for which we have commissioned a private contractor. And this is what I'm going to focus on. In terms of skills and competence, we have already come to one important conclusion. Namely, the staff of my archive, this was the case especially with Florence Vierre, for example, have insufficient background in these questions. This is what we have already heard this morning. Dealing with these issues requires the skills and expertise both of an architect who is used to the specific IT systems and software, and someone familiar with the challenges of long-term archiving, which is not records recording within an architect's practices. Somewhat by chance, 2 years ago, we could commission on those digital files a young architect who had been working with us on classifying classical set of records. The current assignment is being undertaken by a somewhat older architect who has set up an IT service company. We find that however interested these people may be in our archiving dilemmas, they can only work well on such projects if they work in very close collaboration with us. So one of my colleagues, who is a documentalist and designed and built our information system, has to be working very closely as much as them with this research. So there have been 3 successive approaches to the question, unfortunately each rather separate and quite modest in scale and scope. Florence Vière worked on the archives of Pierre Riboulet for the Gaudi program. Then there was the first project 2 years ago on the archives of Adrien Fansilber, and now the new project that has just started is on the same archive of Fansilber. I should state that none of these archives, neither the conventional part nor the digital media, has yet been classified at all. The 2 archives, Riboulet and Fansilber, have various things in common. We could describe them as fairly early digital records from architects. Pierre Riboulet was born in 1928, was a late modern architect and a great draftsman. He drew by hand all his plans, elevation, sections, etc. He was not interested in IT as a design tool, nor at all. Adrien Fansilber was born in 1932, so hardly younger. Has the same traditional attitude towards drawings, although he doesn't draw that much, and towards computers. For both, younger practice managers were the ones who developed and managed the ever more generalized use of IT within the practices. In both cases, the archives donated by the architects contain a large number of paper records alongside the digital archives, but in Fansilber's case, the digital records do not coincide at all with the paper ones. It's not the same projects that are documented by one or the other, and we do not know why the firm couldn't properly explain. The digital files from the Riboulet practice were fairly basic AutoCAD files. In contrast, the Fansilber practice, which I'm going to focus on, had chosen ArcPlus, an advanced 3D drawing package, but they only made limited use of it, generally for 2-dimensional drawing, quite basic two-dimensional drawings. The firm gradually switched over to AutoCAD, but we have ArcPlus files from 1989 to 2003, or more or less. The raw material, therefore, seems remarkably simple, files that were generated in each practice for fairly conventional projects, using a single software package and only drawing on a small number of its functions. In neither case was the firm's founding architect directly involved in producing the files. The scope is, for instance, way more limited than the work carried out by the Canadian Centre for Architecture around the archives of Greg Lynn. However, we feel that our range of objectives is not so easy to achieve concurrently. Let me name them. One would be preserve the original files for long-term storage in a new format or recent versions of the ArcPlus format. 2, identify the duplicates, draft files, to possibly sort out and select some of the files to be preserved. 3, create a read-only and long-term version of the files in a format that should be PDF or similar, vector-based if possible, open and free if possible, and without any significant loss. 4, describe these archives in our inventory database, which was, of course, conceived much before we knew of digital files. 5. Organize the files using a tree structure to match our database structure. This means changing the initial structure, which has certainly already been changed since the initial server in the practice. 6. Created an access route to the digital files from our database inventory. The inventory, an HTML file generated from an access database, should open directly the folders containing the files. These objectives are quite, well, are general, but are quite specific to the way we work with the Archivecture application. So, as with traditional archives, the inventories of the digital files will be available online, but actual consultation of the files should take place only at the IFA archive. This will in particular enable us to manage reproduction and copyright. That's the idea. Now, many questions remain around this issue. The other important aspect of our approach was to look for processes using automatic system and scripts to try to open each file during the process of looking what is inside them and organizing them as little as possible, and hopefully only once for each one of them. This should have a significant effect on the working time, we hope, but seems to be difficult to conceive. So last summer we commissioned an IT and document management contractor, and while the documentary aspects, relationship between the tree structure, files and database should be studied within the archive by the documentalist, as I said. The work in reality is a lot more interwoven between the IT contractor and my staff. Furthermore, this study is funded by the department responsible for archives within the French Ministry of Culture, as part of a nationwide study into file formats for long-term storage of any kind of digital files, and their application to all currently existing formats. So our partner is going to test the 4 most plausible long-term storage formats we have identified for these 2D files: DWF, PDFA, DXF, and the SVJ format, which is sort of recommended in France as being an open format, and the associated conversion and batch conversion options that can be found for them. So what comes out of our first meetings and explorations? We have highlighted the disorder and the lack of rules in place at the time the files were generated. The firm's first IT guidelines date from a later time than the files we are managing. And we found that we come across the frequent absence of presentation files or information about the form in which the practice wanted to generate the printed documents or output documents. Often we find that linked files are missing or cannot be retrieved within the archive. And we have the problems that files and whole directories are saved several times over, and it's time consuming to find what is replication of what and in how much, to what extent. The problem of linked files seems to the moment to be the most complicated one in that particular archive, at least, perhaps due to the ArcPlus system, which was not very clever, very in identifying them. These linked files that may be other files created by the architect, recurring items such as a title block, or other recurring items provided by a system via a library. or some other external source. When the file is created, the file path is normally saved in the master file. The master file can be linked within another file and so on. And when the file names are changed, the system can no longer find it. So what Meijin showed, for example, changing names to a more consistent series of names, seems to be done only when we have linked together all the files that. So we are dealing with error messages, error reports generated when we open the files, and which may help in some cases, but not always, to find the missing files. Not all the linked files are important to look at a master file, but some are really core information. As I said, in addition, files are often duplicated, and we thought that the whole archive was consisted in less than 100,000 files. Then we found that with many zipped files, with contained zipped files, it was 250,000 files in total. Not a real problem, but it's just more time consuming to look at what it is. In the end, we thought, might we not simply allow researchers access to the unclassified digital records, trusting them to find their own way through all this magma to get at the things that they're interested in. After all, students may be born after 1980, and I was not, but they are. So, but after all, we do let some researchers open boxes full of messily stacked archives. However, for those digital records, this seems to be much more difficult. The repetitions, the missing linked files, we feel are a genuine obstacle to consulting the archives rapidly enough to find something. So as I said, we are just starting to explore these files, and the project is going to take a full academic year. What already seems clear, though, is that managing digital archives, reconstituting complete files, identifying which series to keep, converting, describing the files, etc., will take at least as long as to manage traditional records about the same subject. It may even take much longer. Given the limited resources we have, I don't know whether one day we will be able to move beyond these exploratory steps to the full-scale classification of an architect's entire archive. Not to mention that currently what I told is only about drawing records, and besides there are a number of word processing, emails, etc. that may not be so easy to classify. A final observation, well, that goes with what I've said before, is that this type of work needs to be carried out by trained architects who agree to work within the rigorous framework of an archivist's inventory. And this represents a very narrow category of people. I mean, I do not know many people who actually could be given this task if we had money to give to hire somebody. As a very provisory conclusion, it may be that the two archives that we have tried our hand on, we didn't really have much of a choice, are actually not very good examples. In their apparent simplicity, they may conceal more problems than more recent archives because of a greater variety of file formats and software usages, or less or smaller knowledge within the firm. Over the last 10 years, architects' practices have learned to organize their files. Programs now include tools to avoid losing linked files, for example, and backup replication procedures are much more systematically used. I mean, at least I hope. Architects who themselves have to plan for the storage of their archives for many decades must have started to answer some of the questions I've raised. And Meijin pointed that, and we for more recent archives may therefore be easier to work with, and we can possibly assume that there will be a sort of dark period within the 90s and early 2000s in which archives will be less well preserved, and then we can go on with more recent ones. These two small scale, very naive explorations show how many questions the digital files donated by an architect's practice can raise, even when the practice can still give information, which was the case with the actual one. I am again sorry that I had to do this presentation at this very early stage, because I hope that some of the things I mentioned as questions will be in a few months sort of answered, and that we will find solutions which will show that these were not real big problems. Well, thank you for your attention.